Every year, the same publications tell you the best states to retire in America. Low taxes, good weather, affordable housing. They run the numbers, publish the list, and call it research. But here is the question nobody is asking directly. What happens to the people who are already there? The people who bought the house 20 years ago, who raised their kids there, who built a life in a place they planned to grow old in, and are now discovering that the state they chose is not aging well alongside them. Not because of one thing, because of a combination of things: the healthcare system, the crime environment, the cost structure, the weather, the infrastructure, the isolation that accumulates over years into a single conclusion. This is not where I want to be old. In 2025, more than 2.1 million Americans aged 65 and older made an interstate move. Some were chasing opportunity, most were chasing survival. In this video, we're going through 10 states where the conditions for growing old have quietly become untenable. States where seniors who stayed are reconsidering. States where the gap between what aging in place requires and what the state can actually provide has been closing in the wrong direction. Subscribe. Before this list includes a state you're planning to stay in, let's count them down. Number 10, Iowa. Retiring in Iowa is like staying in a relationship because of the history and then realizing the infrastructure that made it work has been quietly dismantling itself for a decade. Iowa has genuinely affordable housing, a cost of living that runs below the national average, low property taxes relative to other Midwest states. On the numbers that make it into the headline, Iowa looks like a reasonable choice for aging in place. And then you look at what aging in place in Iowa actually requires in 2025. Chartis's 2025 State of the State report on rural healthcare confirmed that Iowa had the largest decline in rural obstetric units of any state in the country, losing care at 22 facilities between 2011 and 2023, the highest figure nationally. Obstetric care is not the only service disappearing. It is the most visible symptom of a rural healthcare system under systematic financial stress. According to the Center for Healthcare Quality and Payment Reform's December 2025 analysis, 19 rural Iowa hospitals are currently at risk of closing, with 4 facing immediate closure within the next 2 to 3 years. For a senior in a small Iowa town, the loss of the local hospital is not an inconvenience. It is the removal of the medical infrastructure that made staying viable. A heart event, a fall, a stroke, and suddenly the nearest emergency facility is 45 minutes to an hour away on roads that ice over in winter. Iowa also has one of the oldest and most geographically dispersed rural populations in the country. Senior social isolation in Iowa's rural counties is not a policy talking point. It is the daily reality for thousands of elderly residents whose neighbors have already left, whose children have moved to cities, and whose nearest in-person human contact is a weekly trip to a grocery store that may also be closing. The combination of disappearing healthcare, disappearing community, and disappearing economic activity is producing a specific kind of elderly experience in rural Iowa. Not poverty, not crime, erasure. Picture this. You are 78 years old. You have lived in the same small Iowa town since 1969. The hospital closed 4 years ago. The pharmacy reduced its hours. Your nearest neighbor is 2 miles away, and you are calculating whether you can safely stay for one more winter, not because you want to leave, because the infrastructure that made staying possible has already left without you. One Iowa retiree wrote it in a seniors forum. I did not move away from Iowa. Iowa moved away from me. Iowa is not a failed state. It is a state where the rural infrastructure that supported an entire generation of seniors is quietly contracting, one closure at a time, faster than the people who need it can adapt. Number 9, Delaware. Retiring in Delaware is like choosing the smallest mid-Atlantic state specifically because it seemed manageable, and then discovering that manageable and affordable are not the same word. Delaware has historically been cited for retirement-friendly tax policies, no sales tax, pension exclusions that reduce the income tax burden for many retirees. On the tax side, the pitch is real. And then you look at the rest. Delaware consistently ranks among the highest crime rate states in the country relative to its size. Wilmington, Delaware's largest city, regularly appears on lists of America's most dangerous cities per capita for violent crime. For a retiree who expected to age into a small, manageable, mid-Atlantic state, the crime environment in and around Wilmington creates a safety calculation that was not in the original plan. Delaware's homeowners' insurance costs have also been rising, driven by storm exposure, flooding risk, and the increasing cost of insuring properties in a state with significant coastal and river proximity. And Delaware's senior healthcare infrastructure, while present, is limited by the state's size. Specialists are available, but the concentration is heavily weighted toward the Wilmington corridor. For seniors in the more rural southern portions of the state, Delaware's geography delivers a different experience than the retirement literature suggested. Delaware is also being squeezed between two expensive neighbors. Maryland and New Jersey both push costs in Delaware's direction, including commuter pressure on housing and the cost of services in the northern part of the state. Picture this. You retired to Delaware for the tax structure, the math. Worked when you ran it in 2018. And then insurance went up. And then the neighborhood changed. And then the specialist you needed had a 3-month wait. And the small, manageable, mid-Atlantic retirement turned out to be a small, manageable, mid-Atlantic set of problems. One Delaware retiree described it plainly. Delaware promised me simplicity. It delivered the same complications as every other state, just in a smaller container. Delaware is not a trap. It is a state where the retirement advantages are real and specific, and the disadvantages are also real and specific. And for a growing number of seniors, the disadvantages have been winning. Number 8. South Dakota. Retiring in South Dakota is like accepting a deal with no income tax on the front end and then discovering what the state left off the brochure about the rest. South Dakota is one of only a handful of states with no individual income tax. Social Security is fully exempt. Housing costs are low. The tax structure, on paper, is among the most favorable in the nation. And then the brochure ends. South Dakota has not expanded Medicaid, placing it among the 10 states nationally still operating with significant coverage gaps for low-income seniors who need access to long-term care services. Rural South Dakota has some of the most severe healthcare access challenges in the country. Large portions of the state measure physician access in hours of driving time, not miles. For a senior in a rural South Dakota community, the nearest specialist is often not a planning problem. It is a medical emergency waiting to happen. South Dakota's winters are genuinely severe, with the northern plains delivering temperatures and wind chills that make outdoor mobility dangerous for elderly residents for months at a time. Senior isolation in rural South Dakota is among the most acute in the country. Small towns with declining populations, limited transportation, and no public transit create conditions where elderly residents may go days without meaningful human contact. The combination of geographic isolation, limited Medicaid infrastructure, and severe winter conditions creates an aging environment that the tax savings on the front end do not compensate for on the back end. Picture this. You moved to South Dakota at 65 for the tax structure. The first year was exactly what was advertised. And then at 72, you needed a geriatric specialist, and the nearest one was a 4-hour round trip. And January arrived with a wind chill of -35. And you sat inside your affordable home calculating the distance between where you were and where the healthcare was. One South Dakota retiree wrote it in a retirement forum. The no-income tax promise was real. The rest of what growing old here requires was not in the math I did when I moved. South Dakota is an honest state in a specific way. It offers exactly what it says it offers. The problem is what it doesn't say. Number 7. Utah. Retiring in Utah is like moving to a place that was genuinely good for retirement in 2017 and then discovering that 2025 Utah has been priced and populated into a different state than the one you researched. Utah has been one of the fastest growing states in the country for the past decade. From 2010 to 2020 alone, Utah grew by over 18%, the fastest rate in the nation. That growth has produced housing costs that now rank Utah as the 9th most expensive housing market in the entire country. The statewide median sales price for a single-family home sits at $547,700, according to the Kem C. Gardner Policy Institute's 2025 State of the State's Housing Market Report. Salt Lake and Washington counties are officially classified as severely unaffordable, with housing cost-to-income ratios above 5.1 times annual household income. That ratio is not a projections model. It is the gap between what seniors earn on fixed income and what Utah charges to live in its most populated counties. Utah taxes most forms of retirement income. The flat income tax rate applies to pension distributions and IRA withdrawals. Social Security is subject to state income taxes for residents above certain income thresholds. For a retiree who planned around Utah's tax structure in the early 2010s, the current tax environment plus a severely unaffordable housing market present a calculation that no longer works the way the original research suggested it would. Utah's senior healthcare infrastructure has also not kept pace with the state's rapid population growth. The ratio of healthcare providers to population has been strained by a state that grew faster than its medical infrastructure could expand. For seniors competing for appointments in a system that was already at capacity before the growth wave, wait times and access are genuine daily problems that compound every year. Picture this. You bought a Salt Lake City suburb home in 2016. The plan was solid, and then the neighborhood became unaffordable for anyone arriving on a fixed income. And then the tax bill on your retirement accounts was higher than you modeled. And then your primary care doctor stopped accepting new Medicare patients. And Utah, the state that looked like the smart choice 9 years ago, became a state you are calculating how to leave. One Utah retiree described it in a financial forum. I moved here ahead of the curve, and then the curve moved ahead of me. Utah is a beautiful state with a genuinely strong community culture. It is also a state that priced its seniors out of the growth it spent a decade celebrating. If this is making you think seriously about your plan, hit subscribe. This channel covers what aging in America actually looks like when you remove the marketing. Subscribe now. Let's count down the final 5. Number 6. Indiana. Retiring in Indiana is like choosing a state that presents as reasonable and straightforward and then falling through the specific gaps in its healthcare system in ways that straightforward didn't cover. Indiana has a relatively low cost of living. The flat income tax rate at 3.05% is among the lowest in the Midwest. Housing is affordable. On the basic financial metrics, Indiana is not an outlier in the wrong direction. And then you get sick. Indiana is one of 10 states that has not expanded Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. That gap in coverage creates a specific problem for low-income seniors who fall between Medicaid eligibility at traditional thresholds and the income level that makes Medicare supplemental insurance easily affordable. Indiana also has a rural hospital closure problem that has been accelerating. Outside Indianapolis, Fort Wayne, and a handful of mid-sized cities, healthcare access in Indiana drops rapidly. Southern Indiana, in particular, has some of the most limited rural healthcare infrastructure in the Midwest. Specialist access for seniors in rural Indiana counties requires the kind of planning and travel that healthy people can absorb, but that people managing chronic conditions find increasingly difficult to sustain. Indiana also struggles with one of the higher opioid overdose death rates in the Midwest, which strains the healthcare system that seniors are trying to access for different reasons entirely. A hospital emergency department that is managing overdose volume is a different emergency department experience than the one a senior with a cardiac event needs. Picture this. You retired to a small Indiana city. The house cost $185,000. The cost of living matched the advertising. And then you needed to see a rheumatologist. And then you found out the nearest one accepting Medicare in your county was 80 miles away. And then you discovered that rural Indiana's healthcare map had been redrawn since you moved, and the closest facilities kept getting farther away. One Indiana retiree wrote it in a seniors group. Indiana was affordable. It was also the place where I learned that affordable and accessible are two different things, and that I had been researching one and living inside the other. Indiana is a genuine state with real value for the right retiree. The right retiree needs to be someone who will stay healthy enough, long enough, not to need what Indiana doesn't have enough of. Number 5. Missouri. Retiring in Missouri is like buying into a state with the reputation of Middle America's reliability and then discovering that parts of it are living an entirely different reality than the reputation suggests. Missouri's central position, low cost of living, and moderate tax structure have historically made it a reasonable mid-tier retirement choice. And then you look at the crime data. St. Louis has consistently ranked as one of the most dangerous large cities in America. In recent years, St. Louis has registered one of the highest violent crime rates of any major American city, a distinction that defines the safety environment for seniors across the broader metro area. For a retiree who settled in the St. Louis region for the affordability and the culture, the daily crime environment is not an abstract statistic. It is the calculation behind whether leaving the house after dark is a good idea, whether the neighborhood you chose 10 years ago still has the community character it had then. Beyond St. Louis, Missouri's rural healthcare system is under severe stress. Rural hospital closures in Missouri have been accelerating. Dozens of rural Missouri counties face genuine healthcare desert conditions, where the nearest hospital is a drive that an elderly resident in a medical emergency may not survive. Missouri's senior population in rural areas is growing faster than the state's ability to staff and fund the healthcare system those seniors need. For a senior in rural Missouri with no immediate family nearby and a healthcare system that is getting further away every year, the case for staying is getting harder to make. Picture this. You retired to a small Missouri city with genuine character and affordable housing. And then the neighborhood nearest to you changed. And then the hospital 18 miles away reduced its services. And then a friend from your county needed emergency cardiac care and the ambulance took 42 minutes to arrive. And Missouri, the reliable middle American choice, started looking like a state you were making peace with rather than a state you chose. One Missouri retiree described it plainly. Missouri sold me on the middle. I got the middle of everything, including the middle of a crime problem and the middle of a healthcare desert. Missouri has real value for retirees in the right parts of the state. The problem is that the right parts are getting smaller. Number 4. Ohio. Retiring in Ohio is like choosing a state that still runs on the infrastructure of an era that has been closing its last factories for 30 years and discovering that the healthcare system is one of the things running on that infrastructure. Ohio's cost of living is genuinely below the national average. Home prices in smaller Ohio cities are legitimately affordable. The state taxes some retirement income, but the overall tax burden is manageable. Ohio has the bones of a reasonable retirement choice. And then the opioid crisis enters the calculation. Ohio has been one of the states most devastated by the opioid epidemic. The crisis has consumed enormous healthcare resources, overwhelmed emergency departments, strained hospital systems, and created a public health environment in which the medical infrastructure seniors depend on is managing a dual burden it was not designed to carry. For a senior in Ohio trying to access the healthcare system, the competition for provider time, emergency department capacity, and hospital beds in a system that is simultaneously managing an addiction crisis is a real and ongoing constraint. Rural Ohio's hospital situation is also deteriorating. Dozens of Ohio counties have seen rural hospital closures or service reductions in the past decade. The Appalachian Ohio counties in the southeastern part of the state have some of the most severe healthcare access gaps of any region in the Midwest. Crime in Ohio's urban corridors, Cleveland, Dayton, Toledo, Youngstown, runs well above national averages. Ohio is a state where the parts that are affordable tend to be the parts with the most concentrated challenges. Picture this. You retired to a small Ohio city for the affordable house and the Four Seasons. And then the emergency department of the local hospital shut down its overnight services. And then your neighborhood started showing the indicators that economists measure before they declare a community in decline. And then a friend from your senior center went to the hospital for a hip replacement and waited 6 hours in an emergency waiting room being managed for a population with very different needs. One Ohio retiree wrote it in a local forum. Ohio has everything I needed for retirement. It also has the thing that is eating the capacity of the healthcare system I'm relying on. Ohio is a state with real history, genuine community, and legitimate affordability. It is also a state where growing old requires navigating a healthcare system under permanent stress from a crisis that started in 2010 and has not finished yet. Number 3. New Mexico. Retiring in New Mexico is like being drawn in by the light, the culture, and the cost of living, and then discovering that the state sits at the top of a national ranking that nobody frames as a selling point. New Mexico has the highest crime rate in the United States, not one of the highest. The highest. a crime index that ranks it at the top nationally across multiple independent analyses for both violent and property crime. For a senior, crime is not a background risk. It is a daily operational parameter. It determines whether you walk to your car alone after dark, whether you leave the house when your back is bothering you, whether the retirement community you chose still functions as a community or as a series of locked doors between you and the street. New Mexico also has significant healthcare desert conditions, particularly in its vast rural areas. For a state that is geographically one of the largest in the country with one of the smallest population densities, the distance between where seniors live and where healthcare is available can be measured in hours. The state's median income is among the lowest in the nation, which creates a local economy with limited resources to invest in the senior services, transportation networks, and community infrastructure that aging in place requires. New Mexico taxes. Social Security benefits for residents above certain income thresholds, which adds a tax burden to a retirement income environment that is already being squeezed by the cost of living in a state where healthcare and safety require more expensive management strategies. Picture this. You retired to Albuquerque for the weather, the culture, and the cost of living, and then your car was broken into twice in the same month, and then a neighbor was robbed at 10 in the morning, and then you started calculating what your retirement actually looks like in a state that ranks last in the country for personal safety. And the light and the culture and the affordable housing started to weigh less than the calculation you were running every time you left the house. One New Mexico retiree wrote it plainly. The sun is real. The crime index is also real. And eventually, the sun stops being enough. New Mexico has profound beauty and genuine cultural depth. The crime data is not a narrative or an impression. It is the result of measuring what actually happens to people who live there. And a growing number of seniors who moved there are using the at data to decide where they're going next. Number 2. Michigan. Retiring in Michigan is like choosing a state with genuine seasons, genuine culture, and a genuine sense of place, and then discovering that the state is aging as badly as some of its residents fear they might. Michigan's challenges for seniors are not theoretical. They are historical, geographic, and ongoing simultaneously. Detroit has made genuine and significant progress on crime in recent years. The city recorded 165 homicides in 2025, a 35% reduction from 2023, and the lowest figure since the 1960s. That progress is real, and the city and its residents deserve credit for it. And yet, despite those reductions, Detroit's violent crime rate still stood at nearly 1,800 incidents per 100,000 residents in 2024, the second highest of any major American city, behind only Memphis. Progress and persistently elevated risk are not mutually exclusive. For a senior making a retirement calculation today, both facts belong in the same sentence. The Flint water crisis left a legacy that extends beyond the city limits. For seniors in the affected communities, the distrust of local government, local infrastructure, and local healthcare systems is not paranoia. It is the rational conclusion of watching a public health failure play out in real time and never receiving a complete accounting of the damage. Rural Michigan, particularly the Upper Peninsula, has some of the most severe healthcare access limitations of any region east of the Mississippi. The UP is geographically isolated by the Straits of Mackinac, experiences brutal winters that run from October through April, and has a population too small to sustain the healthcare infrastructure that its aging demographic requires. For seniors in the Upper Peninsula, growing old in place is not a lifestyle choice. It is an act of endurance against a healthcare geography that does not accommodate what aging eventually demands. Michigan also taxes most forms of retirement income. For the majority of retirees, Michigan's income tax applies to retirement accounts, pensions, and investment income in ways that erode the fixed income budget that healthcare and housing are already competing for. Picture this. You retired to a Michigan city you had lived in for 40 years. The house is paid off. The community is familiar. And then you add the persistent crime rates despite every genuine improvement. And then you add the distance from the nearest cardiac center in a rural winter. And then you add the January that dropped to -22 for 8 consecutive days. And then you sit with the calculation and the map and the heating bill, and the question of whether familiar is the same thing as right. One Michigan retiree wrote it in a seniors forum. Michigan is home. I just wasn't sure home had done enough to deserve that. Michigan is a state with deep roots, real identity, and genuine community character. It is also a state where the infrastructure for growing old has been underinvested for decades in exactly the places where seniors are most concentrated. Number 1. West Virginia. Retiring in West Virginia is like watching the data and the ground-level reality converge into the same conclusion from every direction at once. West Virginia is the only state in America that actually lost population between 2023 and 2024. In a country where every other state grew, West Virginia's population declined. Not because people stopped being born there, because the people who were there left at a rate that births could not replace, and the people leaving were the young, which means the people staying are the old. West Virginia ranks third in the nation in the percentage of its population aged 65 and older. It is simultaneously one of the oldest states in America and one of the poorest. Social Security is the sole source of income for approximately 33% of West Virginia. Seniors, 1 in 3, relying entirely on a check that averages around $1,886 per month after Medicare, in a state with the deadliest drug overdose crisis in the country. Rural overdose rates in West Virginia run twice the national average. The healthcare system that seniors need for cardiac care, oncology, geriatric services, and chronic disease management is simultaneously the healthcare system absorbing the consequences of the worst addiction crisis in American history. West Virginia's healthcare infrastructure is ranked worst in the nation by multiple independent assessments. 2/3 of all West Virginians live in underserved rural communities. West Virginia ranks first in the country for heart attack rates. It ranks among the highest for obesity, diabetes, and mental health disorders. And the healthcare system serving a population with those statistics has been losing providers, closing facilities, and contracting its capacity for years. For a senior in rural West Virginia, the distance to the nearest hospital is not a planning question. It is a life expectancy variable. West Virginia also has the lowest number of residents covered by long-term care insurance of any state in the country. Only 17,088 people, in a state of over 1.7 million, have coverage for the long-term care costs that aging inevitably produces, which means when a West Virginia senior can no longer live independently, the question of what happens next has an answer that very few families are financially prepared for. Picture this: you are 80 years old. You were born in West Virginia. You raised your family in West Virginia. Your children have left for Ohio, Virginia, and Tennessee because there was no economic path for them where you were. And you are sitting in a house on a mountain road in a county where the hospital closed, where the nearest specialist is 90 minutes away, and where the only people younger than 60 you see regularly are the ones who couldn't leave. Not because West Virginia failed you personally, because the combination of economics, healthcare infrastructure, population loss, and the weight of the opioid crisis produced a state where growing old has become one of the hardest things a person can do. One West Virginia retiree wrote it with the directness of someone who has stopped pretending. I love this state. I can't afford to get sick in it. And I'm 81. So those two things are in a conversation I don't know how to finish. West Virginia does not make this list because it is a bad place. It makes it because the gap between what its population of seniors needs and what the state can structurally provide has been widening for longer than any single administration, any single policy, or any single crisis can explain. It is the endpoint of what happens when a state loses its economic base, loses its young people, keeps its elderly, and runs out of the infrastructure that growing old requires. The departure is not always a move. Sometimes it is a different kind of leaving, and the data has been counting those too. The states on this list are not the states that made the wrong choice about where to exist. They are the states where the distance between what aging requires and what the environment provides has grown wide enough to make the decision for people who thought they had already made it. If this is your state, that information is not a verdict. It is a tool, and the people who use their tools tend to do better than the people who refuse to look at them. Subscribe, because this channel exists to give you the ones your retirement plan probably didn't include.